I have watched my brother walk into rooms that fell silent just from the weight of his name. I have seen men step back from him as he passed, not quickly, the way you would step from a horse, but slowly, the way you step from something you cannot quite measure. I have watched him sit at a dinner table with earls on his left and a minister of the crown on his right, and I have watched all of them choose their words more carefully than they chose their wine. My brother Callum, the Duke of Dunverin, has that effect on people. He earned it, and for 34 years of my life I thought I understood him completely. Then I watched him walk into the Harwick auction room on a Tuesday in February, and I realized I had never understood him at all. I should not have been there. Neither should he. These affairs, the quiet, shameful rooms where debts were settled in human coin, were not places a duke attended. They were places where minor creditors gathered, where second sons of merchants bid on pieces of furniture and, occasionally, on the futures of girls whose fathers had run out of other things to sell. The smell was tallow candles and damp wool, and something underneath it both that I cannot name, even now, and do not wish to. I had come because a solicitor of my acquaintance had sent a note. There is a matter at Harwick tomorrow that may interest you professionally, a young woman of some education, auctioned against all decent precedent and no one of standing to speak for her. He had known I would tell Callum. He had known Callum would come. What no one had known, least of all me, was what Callum would do when he got there. We arrived late. The room was already full. A dozen men of varying respectability arranged on wooden chairs, an auctioneer behind a low podium, a door at the rear through which the principals were brought one by one. There had already been two before us, a writing desk, a set of silver candlesticks. I noticed with a kind of cold grief that the auctioneer made no distinction in his patter between the objects and what came next. She was brought in by a woman in gray, a chaperone of some kind, or whatever name they gave to the person whose job it was to make the transaction look respectable. The girl walked to the low platform at the front of the room and stood there. She was 20, perhaps 22. Brown hair drawn back plainly, a dress that had once been good quality and was no longer. She did not look at the floor. I will tell you that plainly because I noticed it immediately. She did not look at the floor. She looked at the far wall, slightly above the heads of the bidding men, at some fixed point only she could see. Her hands were clasped in front of her. Her chin was level. Whatever she was feeling, and God knows she must have been feeling it, she had built a wall around it so precise and so complete that the men in the room could not find an edge to push against. I saw two of them shift in their chairs. I think her composure unnerved them. It unnerved me, and I was not even bidding. The auctioneer cleared his throat and began. He mentioned a sum of debts. He mentioned the name of her father, a name I will not repeat here because it does not deserve to be remembered. He mentioned that the young woman was of good education, capable of household management, possessed of sound health, and was to be understood as a ward acquisition in the established legal sense, the arrangement lasting no less than 12 months at the bidding party's discretion. He said all of this in the tone of a man reading a livestock bill of sale, and the men in the room nodded, as though this were perfectly ordinary, as though they did this every Tuesday in February and saw nothing worth pausing over. I was watching the girl. She did not move. The bids began. It was then that I heard the door at the back of the room open, and I heard the particular quality of silence that follows my brother into spaces. He came in without haste. He did not look around the room the way newcomers look around a room. He walked to the left wall and stood there, and I watched his eyes find her, and I watched him go completely still. I have known Callum all my life. I have seen him make decisions that altered the lives of hundreds of tenants and workers and legal dependents. I have seen him negotiate in rooms where the wrong word would have cost the family a fortune. I have seen him grieve once, when our mother died, for exactly 4 days, and then he closed the door of his study, and when he opened it again, he was the Duke, and he was never not the Duke after that. In all the years I have known him, I have never seen his face do what it did in that auction room when he looked at the girl on the platform. It was not desire. I want to be clear about that, because the easy story, the story ungenerous people tell, is that a powerful man saw a beautiful young woman and bought her because he wanted her. That is not what I saw. What I saw was something I can only describe as recognition. As though he had looked across that tallow-lit, shameful little room and seen something that answered a question he had not known he was asking. It was there for perhaps 3 seconds. Then it was gone, and he was the Duke again, and he lifted his hand. "Twice the current bid," he said. The auctioneer stopped mid-sentence. Every head in the room turned. My brother did not acknowledge the attention. He kept his eyes on a point slightly above the auctioneer's left shoulder, which is a habit of his. He never looks directly at people he does not respect, and he did not respect a single person in that room except, I think, the girl. There was a long silence. One man made a counter. It was instinctive, I think, the reflex of someone who cannot bear to be outbid, and then he looked again at who had bid against him, and he sat back and folded his hands in his lap and said nothing further. "Twice the current bid," the auctioneer repeated, and his voice had changed. "Going once, going twice." He paused. The room was silent. "Sold," the auctioneer said, and even he said it quietly, as though he were ashamed to say it at all, and perhaps he was. I watched the girl on the platform. Something crossed her face at the word sold, not despair, not relief, but something in between, something unnameable, the expression of a person who has been braced so long for the worst that the worst arriving feels almost like a kind of rest. Then she looked at my brother, and he looked at her, and it was the first time he had looked directly at anything in the room. He crossed the floor to the auctioneer's table. He settled the matter in cash. He had come prepared, which told me everything about how thoroughly he had thought this through, and he exchanged the necessary papers, and he did all of this without hurry, and when it was done he walked to where she stood on the platform and he said, very quietly, "My carriage is outside. You may take whatever you have brought with you." She had brought a single bag. The woman in gray tried to take it from her. My brother put out one hand, not to stop the woman exactly, just to be between them, and said, "She carries her own things." And that was that. I walked behind them out of the Harwick auction room into the February cold, and I thought, I am going to be watching this for a very long time. The carriage ride from Harwick to Dunvarron was 3 hours. I rode with them, which in retrospect I suspect Callum preferred. Having me there meant it was not two strangers in a closed coach. It was something that resembled, at a distance, a proper escort. He gave her the forward-facing seat without a word, which was a mark of respect. Callum always takes the backward-facing seat when there is a guest, and I had never once seen him deviate from it. He produced a traveling cloak from the compartment under the seat and set it beside her without comment, as though he were simply ensuring the carriage had its correct complement of equipment, and she pulled it around her shoulders with both hands and held it there, and looked out the window at the bare February hedgerows going past. We sat in silence for most of the first hour, not the horrible silence of people who have nothing to say and know it, the other kind, the silence of people adjusting to an altered world. I was the one who broke it. "I am Callum's brother," I said. "My name is James. I am sorry for the circumstances of this meeting." She looked at me steadily. Her name, she said, was Marguerite. Not Miss anything, just Marguerite, offered plainly, the way she had stood on that platform without ornament or apology. Her father's name she did not offer, and neither Callum nor I asked for it. "Dunvarron is large," I said, because I had to say something, "and it is very far north. You will find it cold." "I am not accustomed to warmth," she said, and it was stated as simple fact without self-pity, and I felt the back of my neck go warm with something I can only call shame on behalf of every person in that auction room, including her father. I glanced at Callum. He was looking out the opposite window. The muscle along his jaw was tight. "There is a library," he said without turning his head. If you read. She paused. I read, she said. Good, he said, and returned to the window. And that was all they said to each other for the remaining 2 hours. But when we arrived, when the carriage came up the long approach to Dunverin in the last of the winter light, and the house rose up at the end of the road, all gray stone and lit windows and the smell of peat smoke, I watched her lean forward very slightly in her seat, the way people lean forward when they see something they did not expect to be moved by, and I thought, she is going to be all right. She was given a room on the east wing. A proper room, not a servant's room, not an attic, but a room with a writing desk and curtains and a fireplace already laid, as though it had been made ready for a guest who was expected. Mrs. Dunmore, the housekeeper, showed her up, and I watched Mrs. Dunmore's face going through its calculations. This was not a normal situation, and Mrs. Dunmore was not a woman who encountered abnormal situations without conducting a thorough internal review. But she was also, at her core, a kind woman and kindness won. She called Marguerite Miss, and asked if she required anything before supper, and did not ask a single question that she did not need to ask, and I was grateful to her for that. Callum called me into his study after supper. He was behind his desk. He did not look up from the papers he was moving when I came in, which was his way of pretending he had not been waiting for me. "You are going to tell me I was impulsive," he said. "I was not going to say anything of the kind," I said. "I was going to ask you what you intend to do." He set the papers down. "There is an entail on the northern quarter of the estate," he said. "I need a Duchess of record within 6 months, or the land reverts to a cousin in Edinburgh whom I have met once and deeply disliked. I have been avoiding the problem for 2 years." He paused. "She can be Duchess in name. The entail requires a legal marriage, not a love match. At the end of 1 year, if she chooses to leave, I will settle money on her. Enough that she need never be subject to her father or anyone like him again." I looked at my brother for a long time. "And if she chooses to stay?" I asked. He picked the papers back up. "That is not a relevant question," he said. I did not argue with him. I had known Callum 34 years. I knew exactly when arguing was a waste of breath, and I knew exactly when what looked like a closed door was simply a door he had not yet decided to open. I went to bed. He presented the arrangement to her the next morning in the library. I know because she told me later, in fragments over the following months. She was not a woman who confided easily, but she was a woman who, once she trusted precisely and completely, and somewhere in that long northern winter I became a person she trusted. He had laid it out plainly, she said. The entail, the legal requirement, the 12 months, the settlement at the end. He had used the word arrangement throughout, which she found both clarifying and strangely painful. He had told her she was free to use the house, the library, the stables if she rode, the grounds whenever she wished. She would be introduced to the staff as the future Duchess of Dunverin and treated accordingly. He asked only that she attend the necessary legal proceedings, and once, a formal dinner in Edinburgh in April that the entail's terms required a married duke to host. Otherwise her time was her own. She had listened to all of it. Then she had said, "What do you want from me, in plain language, beyond these arrangements?" And he had said, "Nothing you are unwilling to give." She had sat with that for a moment. Then she had said, "Very well," and they had shaken hands over the library table, and that was how it began. She learned the house the way a careful person learns a new language, methodically, without rushing, not pretending to understand things she did not yet understand. She was up before most of the staff in the mornings. I discovered this by accident when I came down early one Wednesday and found her in the kitchen, not demanding anything, just sitting at the long table near the window with a book and a cup of tea, listening to the morning sounds of the house waking. Mrs. Dunmore found her there too, and instead of being alarmed was, I think, quietly pleased. There is a particular kind of woman who cannot be still in a house she has been asked to inhabit rather than run, and Marguerite was that kind of woman, not in the anxious sense, not in the demanding sense, but in the deep sense of a person who pays attention to things. The first week she spent, largely, simply looking. Not in any obvious way. She was not the sort of woman who wandered about a house examining the furniture and making notes. She looked the way a very careful reader reads, attending to things other people skip, registering what was present and what was absent, building a picture whose dimensions she did not yet share. I noticed her doing it at breakfast, at supper, walking the upstairs corridor, standing at the library window with a cup of tea in her hands and the middle distance somewhere out beyond the garden wall. She was making a map of the house and its people and its rhythms, and of my brother, who was in any house the largest territory to navigate. She asked that first week only necessary questions, not excessive, not timid, exactly necessary in the way that a person with considerable natural intelligence and considerable self-control calibrates. She asked Mrs. Dunmore what time was preferred for breakfast. She asked one of the footmen without any fuss where the laundry was sent. She asked me on the third day whether Callum preferred solitude or company in the mornings, and when I said solitude she nodded as though this confirmed what she had already observed, and arranged herself accordingly. She was, from the first week, a person who took up exactly the space she required and no more, and I found this quality, after a lifetime of people who took up whatever space was available and then some, tremendously restful. She mended things. That sounds trivial. I mean it as the highest possible compliment. She found within the first week that the game register had not been properly updated since the previous autumn and contained 3 errors that would have caused a legal complication in the spring. She corrected them, left the register on the estate manager's desk with a small note explaining the changes, and did not mention it to anyone else. The estate manager came to me somewhat dazed and asked if the future Duchess had a legal background. I said I did not think so. He said she should consider it. She found the library a battlefield. Callum's system of organization was a system only Callum could use, loosely chronological by acquisition date, with subarrangements by subject that existed entirely in his head. Within a fortnight she had rearranged one entire wall by subject with a handwritten index, and then, and this is the detail I love most when I think about this period, she had put the index back exactly as he had found it and left a note saying, "I have rearranged the south wall. If you prefer the previous system, I am sorry and will restore it." He did not restore it. He did not mention it for 3 weeks. Then one evening I was in the library when he came in, went directly to the newly indexed wall, found what he was looking for in approximately 8 seconds instead of the usual 20 minutes, and stood there with the book in his hand, with an expression on his face that I cannot adequately describe except to say, it was the expression of a man being forced to acknowledge something he would have preferred to feel at a more convenient time. He began to find reasons to be in the library in the evenings. I noticed it first in early March, when I went to the library after supper to find a map I needed and found, instead, my brother sitting in the far chair with a book he was not reading and Marguerite sitting at the library table with a book she very much was, and the fire burning between them, and a silence in the room that was, and I want to choose this word carefully, inhabited. Not empty, inhabited. The silence of a room that contains 2 people who are thinking the same thought from opposite sides, and have not yet said so. I found my map. I said good night. Neither of them looked up. I went to bed and lay there for a while thinking that this was going to be the most interesting spring I had spent at Dunvarron in 20 years. She read until very late. I know this because Callum told me obliquely, not volunteering it but responding when I asked what she was reading. He knew. He had been watching. He mentioned it in a careful, neutral tone, the way he mentioned whether or estate yields, and I was very careful not to smile. There was also this. She began in March to notice what he liked. Not in a sycophantic way, not arranging herself to please him, but in the way of a person who pays genuine attention to another person and cannot help registering what she finds. She noticed that he drank his tea very hot, hotter than was advisable and always had. She noticed that he read the morning correspondence in a particular order, the estate matters first and the social invitations last, and that the social invitations went into a drawer that I privately thought of as the drawer of infinite postponement. She noticed that he was patient with the horses and with the staff and almost entirely impatient with his own solicitors, which she told me once with a flicker of dry humor that suggested she found this in some ways understandable. She did not share these observations with him. She kept them with the precision of a naturalist keeping field notes, private, specific, growing. But I was watching her watch him, and I understood that the map she was building of Dunverin had, at its center, my brother, and that she was learning his topography the way she had learned the estate paths, without hurry, without announcement, with the quiet certainty of someone who intends to know the territory well. She rode, too. She had told him she did not ride that first morning in the library because she had not ridden in several years. Her father's horses had been sold long before his debts reached their final reckoning. Callum had simply said there were horses at Dunverin, and Mrs. Dunmore would arrange a suitable one if she wished. It took her 2 weeks to wish it. When she finally came to the stables, tentatively, on a Thursday morning, when she perhaps hoped no one important would be there, Callum was already there, standing in the low half-door of the stall at the end of the row, talking quietly to a gray mare who had been lame since October and was only just beginning to put weight on the leg again. He did not make a great thing of this. He did not perform the moment. He introduced her to the horse with the same gravity he would use to introduce her to a person of consequence, which in his view, I think, horses were, and he told her the mare's name, and the mare's history, and the nature of the injury, and why they were doing what they were doing, which was very little. Just standing, just being present, just letting the mare's leg carry its own weight at its own pace without being asked to do anything more. Marguerite had listened to all of this with her hands folded at her front, and then she had asked, very quietly, if she might come tomorrow morning and do the same thing. He had said yes. She came every morning after that. I do not know at exactly what point it changed between them. I suspect it happened gradually and then all at once, the way most important things happen, a slow, invisible accumulation, and then a morning when everything is different and you cannot identify the precise moment of the tipping, because it was not a single moment at all. What I can tell you is what I saw. I saw him notice when she was not at supper. Not obviously, not looking at her chair or asking after her, but I saw the quality of his attention shift in the room, a fraction of restlessness, a slightly shorter engagement with whatever conversation was happening, until she came in and sat down, and then he would settle again. I saw her notice him in return. The way she followed the line of his argument when he was talking about something that mattered to him. Not politely, the way a guest is polite, but attentively, the way a person follows an argument they are genuinely working through themselves. She pushed back once, at dinner in March, when he said something about the proper role of estate-held schools for tenants' children that I thought was too conservative, and clearly she thought so too, because she said, quietly, without heat, but without any hesitation either, I think you underestimate what a child can learn when the room is warm and the teacher is paid properly. There was a silence. Callum looked at her. Then he said, you may be right, which was not something I had heard him say to anyone at dinner in the previous 12 years, and the table went slightly still, and I looked at my plate and endeavored to show nothing on my face. He began consulting her on things. Small things at first, the household accounts, whether a particular dinner invitation from Edinburgh warranted acceptance. Then larger things, a dispute between two tenant farmers over a boundary that had been festering since the autumn, a question about the drainage of a field on the estate's northern edge that the land agent could not resolve to anyone's satisfaction. She did not give easy answers. She asked questions, the precise kind of questions that locate the actual problem beneath the apparent one. The land agent, a cautious man in his 50s who had initially been coolly polite to her in the way such men are coolly polite to women they do not expect to understand anything, began to seek her out specifically. I watched this with great pleasure and did not say a single word about it to Callum. The Edinburgh dinner was in April. I attended, as a buffer and an ally her description, said with dry humor, and I was glad to be useful. She wore a dress that Mrs. Dunmore had arranged from the modiste in the town, dark blue, simply cut, nothing that shouted money or ambition, everything that said considered, composed, present. She was the least showy woman in that Edinburgh dining room, and she was the only one Callum looked at. The occasion was one of those dinners that the city's grander families give periodically to remind themselves and each other of their relative positions, dressed up in the language of culture and society but serving, at its core, as a kind of elaborate exercise in measurement. Who had risen? Who had not? Who was attending on whose arm, and what that implied about the season's alliances and negotiations. It was not a world I loved, and it was very clearly not a world Marguerite had been formed in. But it was a world she read with the same precise, unillusioned clarity she brought to a flawed estate ledger. I watched her at table, between the second and third courses, conducting 3 simultaneous conversations with the economy of someone who understood social arithmetic, what each person needed from the exchange, what she was and was not willing to give, and how to be entirely courteous while declining, at every turn, to pretend to be less than she was. The host's wife, a formidable woman in gray silk who had known Callum since he was a boy and reserved for herself the right to test anyone he brought to her table, asked Marguerite which families she was connected with. It was asked pleasantly. The question was a blade. Marguerite set her glass down with great composure and said, "None worth mentioning." And then, "I understand you have a remarkable collection of prints from the Low Countries. I have been hoping to see them, if there is an opportunity after dinner." The woman stared at her for a fraction of a second, recalibrating, and then said that yes, she might show them after the dessert course, and the conversation moved on, and I watched Callum at the far end of the table not look at his wife, and yet be entirely aware of what had just happened. There were 2 moments I remember from that evening beyond this. The first, when a baronet's wife, making conversation, asked with bright artificial curiosity how it was that the Duke of Dunverin had come to choose a bride, so she paused quietly. And Marguerite had looked at the woman with an expression of perfect tranquility and said, "I believe he prefers quality to noise," and had returned to her soup, and the baronet's wife had said nothing further, and I nearly put my hand over my mouth. The second, at the end of the evening when the carriages were being called and Callum was collecting her wrap from the cloakroom, a thing he had done without anyone asking him, simply observed she was cold and gone to deal with it, the host's son, a young man of about 25 who had drunk too much and had been watching Marguerite all evening, said something to her as she stood near the door. I did not hear it. I saw her face go still and deliberate, the way it had been in the auction room. And then I saw Callum come through the door behind her, and I saw him look at her face, and I saw him look at the young man, and the young man looked back and went, I think, somewhat cold, because whatever is in Callum's eyes when he is very, very controlled is worse than whatever is in his eyes when he is angry, and everyone in Edinburgh knew it. Callum said, "The carriage." That was all. He put his hand at the very small of her back, the lightest possible contact, the merest indication, and guided her out, and the young man made very sure to be in a different part of the room when we passed. In the carriage she said nothing about it. He said nothing about it. But his hand had stayed at the small of her back until she was safely inside, and after that I counted the distance between them on the carriage seat, and it was less than it had been on the drive to Edinburgh. We returned to Dunverin in the first light of a cold April morning. She slept for part of the journey, her head against the carriage window, and Callum read, or held a book open, at any rate, though when I glanced at him I noticed the page never turned. Spring came slowly to Dunverin. It always does this far north. It comes in stages, a grudging increment of light and warmth each week, until one morning in late April you look out and the hills are green, and you cannot say exactly when they became so. Marguerite walked in the mornings, long walks alone on the estate paths, and she had begun to know the land in the way you only know land if you spend time in it without any aim except the knowing. She knew where the earliest wildflowers came up in the south pasture. She knew the pool where the river bent and the kingfishers nested. She knew which stretches of the upper path were still muddy after rain and which had dried. She told me these things when we walked together on Sundays, which had become a habit. She liked having company that did not require anything in particular of her, and I was content to be that. She had also, by June, acquired a particular relationship with the village below Dunverin. This was not by design. She had gone down the first time simply to walk somewhere new, and she had come back 3 hours later having spent most of them in conversation with the schoolmistress, a young woman from Glasgow who had taken the position 2 years earlier and found the post rewarding and the isolation considerable. Marguerite returned the following week with 2 books she thought might be useful in the schoolroom, and the week after that with a suggestion about the positioning of desks relative to the available light that the schoolmistress implemented immediately, and thanked her for in the kind of brief, practical note that women exchange when they recognize each other as capable without needing to make a production of it. Callum mentioned this to me once in passing, with the neutral tone he used for things that were not neutral at all. He had heard about it from the tenant farmer whose children attended the school. He said, "She has made friends in the village." He said it in the way a man says something that surprises him in a direction he had not expected to be surprised. I said that this seemed likely to be useful for the estate in the long run, and he said yes, which was true, and also not what either of us was actually talking about. She also told me, in fragments and at careful intervals, something of what her life had been before Harwick. Not the auction. She never spoke of the auction directly, not to me and not, I think, to Callum. But before it, the long years of managing a household that was losing its furniture room by room, the letters she had written to distant relatives and received no answer, the particular shame of being a daughter whose education had been excellent and whose circumstances had become impossible, and the gap between those two things that no amount of competence could bridge. She was not looking for sympathy. She was, I understood gradually, simply accounting for herself, saying, "This is what I was made of, and this is what I survived, and this is what I am. And I am telling you because you have been kind to me, and I do not wish to be a person who accepts kindness without offering truth in return." I told Callum some of this. Not the details, those were hers, but the outline, because I thought he needed to understand something of the weight she carried, and because I was his brother and that was my role, the person who said the things he was not yet equipped to say to himself. He listened without interruption, which was how he listened to things that mattered to him. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She has not asked me for anything." "No," I said, "she wouldn't." He turned to the window. "I know," he said, and there was something in the way he said it, a quiet, privately sustained recognition, that made me understand he had been watching her not ask for things for weeks, and that it was this, specifically, that had reached him in a place where very little reached him. Her father arrived in May. I did not know he was coming. Callum did not know he was coming. He simply appeared one afternoon at the Dunverin gate, a man in a coat that had once been good quality and was no longer, which was, I thought grimly, a symmetry I could have done without, and demanded to speak with his daughter. The gatekeeper sent word to the house. Callum was in Edinburgh for the day. I was in the East Wing and received the note, and I was still reading it when I heard footsteps in the corridor and realized Marguerite had heard too. She did not ask my advice. She went downstairs to the front parlor and had him shown in. I followed at a distance, not to interfere, but because I was not willing to leave her alone with him, and because the housekeeper had given me a look that said very plainly, "Go with her." I stood in the doorway. I could not hear every word. I could hear enough. He had come for money. That was the whole of it. He had heard through what channels I could imagine and did not wish to, that she was to be a duchess, that Dunverin was a substantial estate, that the Duke had paid a considerable sum to acquire her from the auction, and he had arrived to suggest, in the language of suggestion that men like him use when they mean something else entirely, that a daughter in her position would naturally wish to ensure her father's continued comfort and silence. Marguerite sat in the chair across from him. She had her hands in her lap and her chin level, which was exactly how she had stood on the platform at Harwich, and I understood that she had been here before, not in this room, but in this position, many times. The specific cruelty of it was that he had made her practice for exactly this. She said in a voice I could hear clearly, "No." He began to explain again, in different words, with more emphasis. She said, "No, not now and not again. I am not going to discuss it further." He stood. I straightened in the doorway. He saw me and stopped. Then Callum's voice came from behind me. I had not heard him return. I had not heard his carriage. I had not heard anything, but there he was, still in his Edinburgh coat, and he had clearly heard enough from the entrance hall, because his face was the controlled, quiet, worse-than-anger face, the Edinburgh face, and it was aimed precisely at Marguerite's father. He came past me into the room. He did not raise his voice. He said, "You will leave this house." He said it the way he said things when there was no remaining subject for discussion, final and calm, and with the full weight of Dunverin and its history and his name and his reach behind every word. "A letter will reach you within the week. It will be from my solicitors, and it will explain, clearly, that the woman in this room is no longer under your legal authority in any form, that any further contact you initiate with her or any member of this household will be met with the full resources of that authority, and that the specific arrangement by which you delivered her to Harwich in February has been documented and will remain documented." He paused. "I suggest you read it carefully." The man went pale. He looked at Marguerite. She looked back at him steadily, the way she had looked at the far wall, and I think he understood something in that look that none of his threats or debts or silences had ever been able to reach before. Then he left. Callum did not speak for a moment after the door closed. Then he said to the room rather than to either of us, "Mrs. Dunmore will bring tea." And he went back into the corridor, and I heard his study door close. Marguerite sat very still for perhaps 30 seconds. Then she breathed out a single, long, quiet breath, and she put her face in her hands, not weeping, just holding the stillness. I sat down in the chair beside her and did not say anything at all, because there was nothing useful to say, and because the most honest thing I could do was simply be there. The solicitor's letter was sent within the week, as he had promised. Summer at Dunverin is a different country from its winter. The light comes late and lingers. At midsummer, it is still bright at 10 in the evening. A long golden wash across the hills that makes the stone of the house look like something lit from within. Marguerite had never been this far north for a summer, and it affected her visibly. She was outside more. She walked further. She laughed more easily, which was something she had been doing in increments since the spring and which had the effect, when it happened, of making the room seem to contain more air than it had before. She and Callum had reached, by June, a kind of daily grammar of proximity that was not the arrangement anymore, or not only the arrangement. They breakfasted together when his schedule permitted. She had taken to leaving books she had finished on the library table with a page folded at a passage she thought would interest him, which was a liberty she would not have taken in the winter, and he had taken to reading them. He left books in return, not with marked passages, because that was not how he worked, but she would find them set out, a slight shift from where they had been, and somehow she always knew. I do not know how they began to understand each other's way of doing things so precisely. I only know that they did. He talked to her in the evenings. This was the largest change, not the most visible, but the largest. Callum does not talk in the evenings as a rule. He is quiet after supper, retreating to his study or to the library with something to read, and the household understands this and arranges itself accordingly. Sometime in May or June, the library had become the place where they both went after supper, for separate purposes, and the separateness had gradually become a shared quiet, and the shared quiet had gradually become conversation. Not always. Some evenings they were both simply there with their books. But the evenings when they talked, I know because I occasionally was there, and occasionally heard it from the library door, and occasionally received a somewhat dazed account from Mrs. Dunmore, who had come to consider the situation with the cautious hope of a woman who had served the family for 20 years, and had never expected to see the Duke choose anyone at all. He told her about the estate, not the practical details but the deeper ones, the history of particular fields, a dispute 2 generations back that had shaped the northern boundary, the particular quality of the light on the upper pasture in August that his father had loved, and that he had loved too, and had never said so to anyone. She told him about her education. It had been her mother's priority, fiercely maintained through diminishing circumstances, 3 languages and a history of mathematics and a library that had been the last thing in the house to be sold, and she had been in the middle of a Greek history when the bailiff came for the shelves, and she had carried the book out under her arm and had it still. She had it at Dunvarren. He asked to see it. She brought it down from her room. He held it in the way people hold things that have survived something, carefully and with appropriate gravity, and he said, "Your mother sounds like a formidable woman," and Marguerite said, "She was. I think you would have respected each other." And he looked up at her with something in his face that was not composed and not controlled and was entirely present, and then he looked back at the book, and they said nothing for a moment, and the fire went on burning. The year was drawing toward its end. August arrived and the light began to change again, not retreating yet, but deepening, the long evenings going to amber earlier, the mornings carrying that first faint suggestion of autumn that comes to the north before anywhere else, and that I always find, in spite of everything, beautiful. The library evenings had become, by this point, simply a feature of Dunvarren. The household had ceased to remark on them. Mrs. Dunmore had ceased to find them worthy of her expressive silences, and the staff had adjusted their own routines around the understanding that the library was, after supper, occupied. I walked past the library door one evening in late August and heard them arguing about a history of the Jacobite risings, calmly, intently, neither yielding an inch of ground. I stopped and listened for a moment. Callum was making a point about the structural failures of the 45 with the confidence of a man who had read the primary sources. Marguerite was making a counterpoint about what the sources omitted with the precision of someone who knew exactly why certain things are never in the primary sources. There was a pause. Then Callum said, "Where did you read that?" And she gave him the name of a book that was, I was fairly certain, in the Dunvarren library, on the shelf she had reorganized in February. There was another pause. Then the sound of someone crossing the room to check, which I was willing to bet was Callum. I walked on before he found it. In August I found him at his desk with the legal document relating to the end of the arrangement, the settlement terms, everything properly drawn, and he was not signing it. He was looking at it. I came in and sat down across from him and waited. "She has a right to leave," he said finally. "She does," I said. "The terms are fair," he said. "She would be well provided for. She could go anywhere." "She could," I said. He looked at the document. "She has not said anything," he said. "No," I said, "she wouldn't." He was quiet for a moment. What if she is staying because it is what she was acquired for, and she does not know how to say otherwise? I looked at my brother for a long moment. I thought of the woman who had corrected the game register without being asked. I thought of the woman who had said, "I believe he prefers quality to noise," to the baronet's wife. I thought of the woman who had said no to her father in a voice that did not waver. I said, "Callum, she knows how to say otherwise. It is possibly the thing she is most capable of." He said nothing. Tell her the year is up, I said. Tell her she may go, and then stop talking. He looked at me. Then he set the document face down on the desk. When did you become useful? He said, which from Callum is an expression of deep brotherly affection, and I left him to it. He found her in the garden on a Thursday morning in September. I know because I watched from the library window, which is not something I will admit to often, but which I am admitting to now because I think the scene deserves a witness. It was early. The light was still low, coming sideways across the hill, the kind of autumn light that turns everything amber and makes the shadows long. She was standing at the stone wall at the garden's far edge with her hands resting on the top of it, looking out at the hills, which she did sometimes in the mornings, just looking without any apparent aim, the way she did everything that mattered to her. He came across the garden toward her, not quickly. He had a way of moving in that house in those months that had changed. He had always moved as though he owned the ground he walked on, which he did, but now he moved as though the ground also contained something he was careful not to disturb, and that was new, and it was entirely about her. She heard him coming and turned. They were perhaps 6 feet apart. I watched him say something. I could not hear it through the library glass. I saw her face at the receiving of it, the particular stillness she had before she made a decision, the chin leveling, the eyes very clear and direct. Then she said something back. Then he stepped toward her 1 step, the second of the 6 feet, and he went down on 1 knee, there on the flagstones of the garden in the September morning, and I pressed my knuckle to my mouth and looked away because the next part was not mine to watch. I know only what she told me later in the library, when she sat across from me with her hands folded, and that precise direct quality of hers fully present, with the addition of something that had not been there in February, something warm and settled and quietly, privately lit. He had told her the year was up. He had told her the terms of the settlement were ready, and she was free to go anywhere, with every assurance of being cared for. He had told her, and this is the part I return to, when I think about my brother and what he is underneath everything people fear about him, that if she wished to go, he would think no less of her, that she had honored every agreement between them with more grace than he had deserved, and that whatever she chose he would ensure it was what she actually wanted, and not what she felt she was permitted to want. And then he had said, "But I would like to ask you not to go. I would like to ask you to stay, not under the arrangement, but as," and here he had stopped, because he was not a man who found these words easy, which she had known for months, "as my wife. As the woman I would like to walk these grounds with, and argue about books with, and go to Edinburgh with, and grow old with. Not because the entail requires it, because I cannot now imagine Dunverin without you in it, and I do not wish to learn how." She told me he had then said, with an expression that had cost him something, "And I am aware that is an enormous thing to ask of you, given how this began, and I am asking it anyway, because I think you deserve to hear it plainly rather than be left to wonder." She looked at me across the library table, my brother's wife, and she said, "He was right about the plainness. I always preferred it." "What did you say to him?" I asked. "I told him," she said, "that I had been ready to leave in February and ready to leave in March and April and May, and that somewhere in June I had stopped being ready, and by August I had understood why, and by September I had been wondering whether he would ever say anything." She paused. "And then he got off the flagstones because they were damp, at my suggestion, and we went in for breakfast." I laughed. I could not help it. She smiled too, the particular smile she had, which was not performed and was never frequent and was exactly right every time. "He brought me the Greek history this morning," she said. "He has left notes in pencil in the margin. I shall have to read them all." "You will find them worthwhile," I said. "He annotates in a very orderly way." "I have noticed," she said. "He is orderly about most things." "He is," I said, "except apparently falling in love." She looked at me steadily for a moment, and then she looked down at her hands on the library table, and the thing that was in her face was so private and so whole that I had no business looking at it, and I looked at my tea instead. They were married properly, in the stone church in the village below Dunverin, on an October morning when the hills were red, and the sky was the particular clear blue that comes to that part of the north only in autumn. There was no great assembled society. There were the household staff and 2 tenant families and Mrs. Dunmore, who wept openly and did not apologize for it, and the schoolmistress from the village, who had received an invitation delivered by Marguerite herself the week before, and who came in her good dress with her hair very neatly arranged and sat in the second pew with the expression of someone trying to be composed and not quite managing it. There was also the gray mare's farrier, who had heard about the occasion through channels I did not fully understand and appeared at the door of the church with his cap in his hands, and asked whether it would be acceptable if he stood at the back. And I said yes, of course, come in, which he did, and stood with his enormous shoulders squared and his cap at his chest for the entire ceremony, which I found deeply affecting. And there was me, standing at my brother's side, watching him watch her walk up the aisle. She had no father to give her away, which suited everyone involved perfectly. She walked alone, which suited her. She wore the blue dress from Edinburgh, not the same one but the same spirit, simple, considered, entirely her own. Her hair was dressed with small autumn flowers that I recognized from the garden at Dunverin, which meant she had gone out to the garden in the early morning before the ceremony and chosen them herself, which was exactly the kind of thing she would do, and exactly the kind of thing that no one else would think of. She walked in the plain, level way she did everything, as though she were walking towards something she had already decided and had no need to be uncertain about. He said his vows in a voice that was entirely steady. She said hers the same way. The vicar, a sensible man who had known Callum since boyhood, pronounced them married with a briskness that I thought was either admirable efficiency or gratitude to be done before the weather changed. And then he closed his book, and my brother took both his wife's hands in his. The first time I had seen him take her hands, though I had watched him find 100 ways to be near her without quite doing so. And he held them for a moment with the same careful gravity he had brought to that gray mare's injury and to the Greek history, and to everything that mattered to him. She looked up at him, he looked at her. I did not hear what he said to her then, because it was not said for me, or for the vicar, or for any of the absent society that had made her stand on a platform in a tallow-lit room in February. It was said only for her, quietly, in the October morning in that village church. Whatever it was, I saw her close her eyes for a moment and then open them, and whatever she was, whatever the auction room and her father and the long years of managing the unmanageable had made and not made of her, she was more wholly and more entirely herself in that moment than I had seen any person be in any moment I could name. Outside, after, the October wind came off the hills, and the village children came to see the Dunverin carriage, and Mrs. Dunmore offered shortbread from a tin she had brought in her coat pocket, and my brother stood in the autumn light with his wife's hand on his arm and showed something on his face that I had not seen there before and that I knew, even then, I was going to remember for the rest of my life. It was not triumph. It was not pride. It was something quieter and more durable than either. It was the face of a man at home. I have watched Callum walk into rooms that fell silent from the weight of his name. I have seen men step back from him as he passed. I have watched him negotiate and grieve and manage, and lead with a precision that cost him things he never spoke of. And I have watched him, in the October light outside a village church on a Scottish hill, stand next to a woman who had held her chin level in a room where nobody was keeping track of her dignity, and be simply hers. People ask me sometimes how it happened. Not people who know him well, they know better than to ask, but people at the edges of the story, people who heard it second or third hand and could not quite square the man they knew Callum to be with the account they had received. They tend to frame the question in a particular way. They ask what she did, as though she must have deployed some strategy, some particular art. as though there must be an explanation that accounts for it in the language of calculation, because in the world those people inhabit, everything significant is a calculation. I tell them the truth, which is this: she did not do anything. She was simply herself, entirely and without apology, from the first morning in that house to the last evening of the arrangement and beyond it. She was competent and honest and quietly funny and entirely unwilling to be less than she was, even when being less than she was would have been easier and safer and required much less courage. She had held her chin level in a room where she was being sold like a piece of furniture, and she went on holding it level in every room after that, not because she was performing dignity, but because she had discovered, somewhere in the long years before Dunvarron, that it was the only thing that was actually hers, and she had kept it. And Callum, who had spent 38 years looking for something he could not have told you he was looking for, had walked into the Harwick auction room on a Tuesday in February, and found it standing on a platform in a dress that had once been good quality. That is the whole of it. I know no better story. I have not looked for one. The grey mare, for what it is worth, made a full recovery. Marguerite had brought her a piece of apple from the kitchen every morning since March, and by October she would come to the stall door when she heard her step. Callum pretended not to notice this. He noticed everything. Some mornings still, I come to the stables early and find them both there, my brother and his Duchess, standing in the low half-door of the inn stall, not saying very much, the mare's breath in small clouds in the cold air, the hills going gold behind the estate. Marguerite always has her hands folded. Callum always stands a little closer to her than the space requires. They do not seem to mind the cold. I think they do not mind very much of anything these days.